Hi, I'm David Wilson, CEO of Fosway Group, and we're a research analyst firm based in Europe. We've been looking at skills for a long time. I set up Fosway Group 25 years ago, and one of the areas we almost started looking at from the beginning was around the way in which organizations were trying to manage the capabilities they had in a company. But what we found, particularly over the last few years, is that that topic has become super important to companies, and you only need to listen to CEOs talking around their challenges in organizations. Even coming up into the pandemic, pre-pandemic period, there was a significant focus around the skills issue. And it's one of the things that's become hypercritical for companies as they've gone through and coming through to the sort of post-pandemic period. So what I want to talk to you about today is, so effectively our research around this and trying to get a sense around why that skills topic has become really center stage for a lot of organizations, what they're trying to do about it, where they are in terms of their processes and their priorities that they're setting around this, and also how it fits into that wider HR and talent ecosystem. Not least because it seems that when you look at the different parts of the market, particularly on the supply side and the vendors, that almost all parts of the HR ecosystem are trying to grab hold of skills and make it their own. They're trying to own it, and they're not necessarily very good at sharing. So I want to talk about the realities around that and what companies can do in terms of thinking about it. And in particular, obviously, they're moving ahead and really thinking about some of the strategies and lessons they can learn in terms of managing skills going forward. So as a start point, really, I think just trying to think about some of our underlying research and trying to get a sense of the importance of this topic. I think it's quite critical that we understand, some of the underlying context, effectively the drivers, the things that are really changing. And we can talk quite glibly around the transformation of work and of HR and so on. But actually, these things are hugely important in terms of understanding why skills is so important to companies going forward. It's also a huge challenge. We know that we're obviously in a period of supposedly coming out from the pandemic. We spent most of the last 18 months, 2 years sort of dealing with the consequences of that. We probably started to talk about new normal and post-pandemic maybe even 12 months ago, and we're still a long way from being there. And it's had a massive impact on the HR agenda. 93% of organizations saying it's significantly impacting their strategy and how they're dealing with things. And obviously that changed over the period of the pandemic. In the early days, maybe they were focusing on just keeping the lights on, working out what was going on at all. As they go through that, how do we operate in this kind of new situation, which challenged everybody in terms of understanding what it was, and then how do our shifting priorities change over time to be able to really address some of the critical issues that arose from the pandemic, not least of course dealing with work from home and lockdowns and things, furlough schemes in Europe, layoffs, big layoffs obviously in some industries and so on as well. It's really impacted the way that the HR has started to approach things. And that change has moved also away from a lot of business as usual barriers that were there around the way that HR would function and what they would look at. And I think that creates some opportunities also for further changes and transformations to come. When we think about what's changing, it's not just the pandemic. Obviously, we've now got a lot of discussion around, for example, ESG related topics and climate change. We've got multi-generational workforces. We've got a big digital transformation that was already underway. We've got huge issues around potentially things like, well-being and so on that are in organizations. And we've also got some pretty big things. So, if you read the business papers, they'll talk a lot around the so-called Great Resignation. With a lot of individuals potentially making different life choices about where they want to work. You see, big challenges around hiring, big issues around sort of employer brand and reputation, and even quite, sort of progressive and attractive companies sometimes getting challenged by the way in which they are seen by employees and or future candidates and so on. Underneath that, we've got this kind of magic expression we keep talking about around the employee experience and what drives that employee experience for people and how paramount that is. And all of these things, I think, in reality, just make everything super complex in terms of understanding, what you do as an HR function and how you address that and what your strategies are taking that forward. And there's a lot of potential antidotes to some of those problems, whether we're focusing around sort of the way we track and engage people, the way we engage them into the workplace, the way we look at things like well-being, engagement, continuous feedback, etc., etc. And I'll come back and talk about some of these topics later on. And obviously at the heart of some of these things is also around skills and capability. What skills do we need in the organisation? What capabilities do we need? What have we got already? How does that enable us to function more in the future? Another critical challenge, I think, that sits above all of this is what's going on with companies. One of the things we like to ask within Fosway is really what's really driving your business as a whole. And we know, obviously, recently the pandemic has been a massive driver of what's going on, but it's not the only one by any stretch of the imagination. And we've been asking this question probably for 8 years, something like that, in terms of really trying to understand behind our what we call our HR realities research, what's really driving kind of decisions. And number one in across our audience certainly is around driving the performance and the profitability of the business. That's always been the number one. I think what's interesting is over that period, what we've seen is business agility turn out to be a very clear number two in generally, and both in terms of its, where that's gone up the pecking order, but also where it is in terms of the criticality of it. And our pandemic has proved that beyond any reasonable doubt. Companies had to pivot, very, very quickly to work out how they functioned, what they were doing, who their customer, how they were serving their customer, maybe how they preserved cash or not cash, etc. during the process. And then ultimately, of course, what we've seen is a lot of growth and transition, particularly in the digital space and the tech markets and so on. And every company basically becoming digital as part of a way of accelerating that agility. The third area is obviously around customer service as well, and the way in which you can serve your customers and the capabilities that you again have to do that as well. And I think one of the things that's really clear when you look at this and you look at the way that companies function now is that the biggest driver probably of that agility function is people, and one of the biggest barriers to that agility is people. So great people power great agility, but at the end of the day, we have to understand how those people align to that. They individually need to know, companies need to know how they align their people, how they maximize and optimize the talent they've got, and of course how they also add new talent, build new skills, and keep up as everything is changing so fast. This research also talks about some of the measures that HR is using around it. So, employee engagement is hugely important. Obviously, that was also fairly significantly changed and challenged by what's gone on with the pandemic. Being an employer of choice, digital ready culture, strong talent pipeline, all very important measures of HR's view of its own success. And interestingly, very little about transactional measures. These are a lot around, the people and capabilities that we have going forward. I think the big challenge with all of that is that finding great people and holding on to them has turned out to be hugely challenging. And in many ways, the pandemic has actually magnified that problem. Companies were forced to make very big changes around the way that they managed staff and potentially employed them or didn't, or furloughed them during, quite existential business challenges for them. I mean, and many organizations are still, yet to truly come out of that. If you ask, this question was actually interestingly asked before the pandemic. And we got very, very similar results. When you say can you hire the skills you need in your organization? Most, certainly large companies, say no. 93% saying it's either difficult or very difficult to hire the skills they needed. That statistic is pre-pandemic, right? It's also now true as well. A lot of the skills that companies couldn't hire before are even more in demand now because of the, what's happened with the pandemic. Things like digital skills, agile operating approach, critical thinking skills, data analytics, and a lot of those skills they couldn't hire before are even more in demand now because every company's had to become a digital business. Every company's had to become agile. Every company's had to become a knowledge business to some degree as well. And that's become a really important part of what we're doing. So great people are hard to find, and that's very much aligned with what's going on the underlying agenda. And I think when we start to look at how we solve that problem, how we fill vacancies, we fill skills gaps in the organization, okay, so this is changing a little bit. I mean, historically, a lot of organizations would have just tried to hire to fill. That was their kind of primary strategy. Now what we're seeing is obviously a lot of organizations trying to reutilize the resources they've got. And during this, I'll talk a little bit more about upskilling and reskilling and realigning the organization to what we think the future of that is going to be. Interestingly, when you look at proactively developing people to ensure we've got people in the right roles and maybe even empowering people to self-develop around that, often that's not necessarily the biggest part of the equation. And in this data that we've gathered this year, it's still a firm third on the list, which is kind of amazing when you think about it. In terms of, particularly when we think around the skilled people in an organization, surely it's a lot easier to develop the ones you've got than it is to necessarily just keep hiring people to do it. That's a very expensive strategy, and it leads to staff churn internally as well as staff churn in terms of people you're hiring that don't stay and so on and things like that. But there's clearly, some other things going on here. The other thing, of course, is, remote working, hybrid working. So I think pretty much every organization, particularly on their white collar workforce, is assuming that the future, kind of immediate future anyway, at least for the next couple of years, is likely to be hybrid. Nobody really knows what hybrid is. Some organizations came out quite early on and talked about everybody being in the office. Others talked about nobody being in the office. And most of those have then backed off those positions, have moved to a more kind of considered position, if you like. But actually, we still don't really know. We're still seeing evidence of lockdowns and pandemic-related changes in different parts of the world, and potentially significant concern around the fourth, or will it be fifth wave, or whatever it will be coming forward. And I think that's having a significant impact, not just on those, resignation and personal decisions that people are making, but also on trying to understand what the operating model of the company is and how, again, you deal with that, particularly in this constant change and need to be agile environment. And I think underneath all of this is a basic truth, that when we look at what we would call the traditional talent management processes that we've used to manage maybe from recruit, develop, perform, retain type cycle, the classic kind of talent life cycle, frankly, they've just not done the job that they needed to do. They've not scaled properly. They've not been fast enough. They've not really been resilient to the challenges that organizations have had to deal with. And that's forcing a lot of companies, and this is reflected through into our research, whether it's around looking at HR as a whole or looking at things like talent and what we call talent and people success. It's reflected through there in terms of really challenging some of those traditional assumptions around the talent life cycle and thinking about, okay, how do we really dial this up or down? How do we fundamentally change it, disrupt what we're doing in order to create stronger outcomes? Why am I talking about all of this? Because basically skills sits at the heart of a lot of this. There's some huge challenges around that, but it's something that the organisations are really engaging with. I'm assuming, a conference like this, you're pretty already engaged around that topic. Otherwise, you probably wouldn't be listening. But at the end of the day, these things are quite challenging for organisations to manage, particularly in a systemic level. So just to give you some data points around that, again, this is from some skills research we did earlier this year. 75% of organizations saying they've got significant skill gaps. Put that together with 93% saying they can't hire them very easily to fill it. That's obviously a huge challenge. Only 45% think they have a good understanding of the skills profile of their organization, and I probably would challenge that assumption. I think when we dig behind that, we'll find that's probably an optimistic figure. 60% of organizations don't have any kind of significant consistent framework for how they're looking about managing and tracking skills in their organization. That's a pretty poor starting point to then talk about skills as being critical for the future. The pandemic's directly impacted this. So when we look at the importance of skills, this is a really strong data point. 58% of organizations increased the importance of skills in being able to deal with the consequences of that, and obviously plot a path through to wherever we see the organizations going in the future. So that's a huge shift as well. Another kind of key statistic here is, 56% of organizations saying it's accelerated their skills agenda. In some ways, that's not a surprise given the previous statistics, and it's more important now than it ever was. So really driving towards that, and 42% looking also at things like talent mobility around that as well. So the ability to optimize the talent we have in the organization and how we can realign that to the needs of the organization, to the needs of whatever we're dealing with at this point in time, the projects we have, the customers we have, and so on. Driven by not just the organization, but the employees themselves, the talent themselves. These are all becoming super critical topics for companies. We're seeing lots of investment and interest around the kind of solutions that obviously can help you manage those. I'll come back to that obviously a little bit in the presentation. Interestingly, about 62% of organizations think they have an approach to upskilling and reskilling that's fairly mature, which is kind of interesting given some of the other data points. So I think sometimes organizations are thinking that they have a good strategy here. Objectively speaking, I think that's very rarely true. I think that there are certain organizations which are definitely really focused on this quite early on, probably before they even came into the pandemic, and the pandemic has just accelerated what they're trying to do. There's also a data point here from some research that PwC did in 2020 saying, that only 18% of CEOs thought they made significant progress on the skills agenda, and skills was a critical topic pre-pandemic. It wasn't just caused by the pandemic. The pandemic has just magnified and accelerated it in terms of what it's trying to do. The other, some other really kind of critical points here. The first one is really strong. Is only 5% of organizations think they had a very effective way at managing workers and opportunities and roles. 5%, that's a really small number, I think. I mean, we can argue about whether very effective is a high barrier to kind of achieve, but actually I think the general sense here is that organizations struggle to understand the skills they've got. They struggle to understand the needs that they have in the future, and they are struggling to work out how they allocate those. 7% saying they've got a fully integrated approach to skills and linking skills to things like people experience and so on. A third probably having some kind of consistently using skills as part of their process. So that's huge numbers that are like not very far at all in terms of the maturity of working out how they manage this stuff. When we asked organizations as part of our skills research, what were the main challenges? I mean, there's a very long list, but from a qualitative point of view, some of the things that are coming through, which is, and I think this is what we're seeing in a lot of the conversations that we're having with companies, is huge increase in awareness around the kind of strategic importance of skills in organizations, significance focusing around reskilling, particularly as we try and realign the organization away from what we were doing, again, in a pre-pandemic mode to the operating reality and the future paths that we're trying to do. It has caused significant challenges, and arguably, with the financial climate and the way that that's also impacting stuff, I think even going forward in 2022, we'll see significant realignment of a lot of organizations, divestitures of parts of the business, M&A, companies ceasing to be in certain markets and so on and things like this, as they really try and work out what their strong operating potential is going forward. I think the other one is is that when you had that skills conversation before, for a lot of organizations, particularly ones with a very strong training mindset, they felt they had a good strategy towards it. And in reality, what it's turned out to be is that most of that training became fairly irrelevant or fairly undeliverable when they transitioned to online. Suddenly everything had to be digital. If it wasn't digital, it wasn't going to happen. And they had to really transform the way of thinking about it. And as I said, on the talent side of the equation, a lot of those traditional talent processes and the idea of future career paths maybe mapped around data that's 30 years old just became irrelevant. And I think that's what we've got to try and deal with going forward and really address. The other big thing, which sounds simple, but it's just identifying the skills we've got and what are the right skills that we need to have going forward. And I'm not going to go into any detail either, but we also talk about the half-life of skills and how quickly that changes. And it's quite common when you're in these conversations for people to be talking around, that we don't really even know the skills that we need next year, let alone in 5 years' time. How are we going to, understand what that looks like? And I think that put that together with the idea that you could then map job roles forward based on data that's 30 years old, and career options for people that's based on 30-year-old views of what skills and what roles we have. It's just, they're irrelevant really in terms of what it is. At best, they might be a proxy view of what we're looking for. The other challenge is that there's no consistency here. Right? And, when we look across the organization and even when we look across HR, there's no real consistent lens of what we think around with skills and how they connect into the different processes and systems that we have. The view of skills that we have maybe in recruiting was very different to what we had in career ladder, which was very different to what we had for learning, and the competency frameworks that we had in learning. And, putting these together was already a challenge. Just anecdotally, one organization talked to me around the fact that they were trying to bang together, really put together their whole talent and learning processes, and they had, but they were trying to use a taxonomy that they used in their career management and talent succession process that had 80 people a month going through it, and trying to join that up with a learning academy that had 10,000 people a month going through it, which had much more granular view of skills. So these things are not easy to align, and obviously if they're not aligned, then it's really, really hard to understand how you measure, manage and improve, which is ultimately what we're trying to do. And I think this is a critical challenge we need to really think about. The other thing is that those strategies to address skills are also super siloed, into recruiting, into learning, into talent. And we, clearly we need to join those things up. We need to understand and have a more holistic view of what it is, particularly if we want skills to be the heart of the conversation going forward. We need to have a common view of what those things are, and that needs to sort of be able to join up somehow. And ultimately that brings us back to that point we were talking about around business agility and the ability to, adapt and make the organization more resilient to future changes, to evolve faster, to serve customer needs faster, and so on, without a coherent, connected view about what those skills are from across the whole of the life cycle. And you can see on the right-hand side here, I'm talking about some of the key areas that we're getting in. Obviously, yes, upskilling and reskilling, but also, what do we get through work? What do we get through things like opportunity marketplaces and talent marketplaces and so on? What do we get through different resourcing models? Is it gig or is it employed? What are we getting when we think around global mobility and how we move resources and move talent around the organizations and so on? So there's lots of different inputs to that. all of which have got, kind of different, as I said, potentially quite siloed views, and we need to really join those up. And ultimately, I think, again, come back to the context of this event and the kinds, I'm sure, the kind of messages you're hearing from the other speakers. That's a lot of what organisations are really trying to focus on now, really trying to leap ahead of this and create a much more connected view of what they look like. Ultimately, of course, and come back to, in some ways, the purpose of what we're talking about today, that ties back into into the systems and the processes that we use to support not just the HR processes, but the way in which those people processes also intersect with that really important thing called work. How do we kind of bring this together? And again, this is something from our skills research. 96% of organizations, strangely enough, sitting there going, this is, important or very important in terms of the use of technology to how we manage these things. I set up Fosway 25 years ago, and as I said, we were looking at skills and capabilities and things right from the get-go. I've had in my previous incarnations before I even set up Fosway, I've built out big skills assessments for organizations, trying to optimize in a professional service business, for example, our ability to manage projects. Pretty much all of those initiatives in the past have failed to some degree, or have got neutered down to the point where they're really, or watered down to a point where they're really only providing a kind of high level view of what those skills were, because it was just impossible to manage in scale. And I think that's the opportunity here, is how do we really do this at a granular level that can impact the opportunity for the company. That means about the ability to allocate the right people to the right work at the right point in time to create the right outcome. And also the opportunity for the employees themselves, because if we don't optimize that as well, we lose them, right? They don't stay. And we've known that for a long time. In some ways, the anchor pillar for talent management stopped being performance and really became development a long time ago. It was one of the principal reasons why people joined a company. It was one of the principal reasons why they left a company if they didn't get it. And it's also obviously one of the critical functions in building the capabilities of the organization going forward. So that shift was already there. But now we've got to do this with a much more aggressive, much more assertive plan. We've got to be able to do it a lot faster and more comprehensively. And we have to be able to serve, the multiple, perspectives of this, whether that's from the company's perspective, from the employee's perspective, and also from obviously looking at it around the teams in a business. That ultimately is driving what we talk about as a new wave of innovation, and really shift the focus of talent management away from maybe that traditional management life cycle to a much more disruptive view, much more agile view around what we now talk about at Fosway as talent and people success. And I'm going to talk now to you a bit more about that and really try and think about the role that skills clearly plays within that whole kind of view around talent and people success. I put this right-hand side of this slide up on before, which was talking about, what were the challenges we were dealing with and some of the maybe antidotes. And I think the question there that's asking, which is really, really important, is, actually, are your HR systems an enabler or a disabler of your ability to address those things on the right-hand side? And in particular, obviously, some interesting data we've been doing for a few years, looking at very simple question in some ways, but are your HR systems or talent systems or learning systems or whatever, are they actually fit for the modern workforce anyway? And what you see is a lot of organizations saying no. This is actually, in this data is from 2021, so it's actually very current. What we've seen now is, because of the shift of the pandemic, in some ways this is balanced off a lot more, right? But it's still got 42% of organizations saying no. Typically, when we asked that for the last 2 or 3 years prior, it was about 60 to 70% saying no, they're not fit for purpose for the workforce. And I think if you think about what we talked about, the changes that are happening with work, with the worker, and with the workplace, then in some ways the changes that have happened around work are more in the last 12 months than they've been in the probably previous 5 years. So I think there's some huge challenges that we've got to do to try and keep up with them. This slide really covers kind of a very granular view, maybe on the left hand side. We have the traditional talent life cycle, from workforce planning down through hiring and training and succession and all those kinds of processes. What's interesting is on the right hand side is this is something that we've been talking about for some time at Fosway. Is we've just seen that shift towards a much more disruptive approach. And one of the things that's kind of interesting is when you talk to particularly the C-suite and go to them about, what for you is around your people or your biggest challenges, a quotes just good enough process, something that's okay is just not good enough now when it comes down to really kind of high priority areas where you're trying to be much more disruptive, whether that means I just can't hire enough of the right people. I need a more radical answer. If I've got big issues around great resignation and retention, I just need a more radical answer. And clearly from things like learning and training perspective, we've had to have a much more radical answer anyway, because we had to stop all that face-to-face training delivery and move towards virtual and online. Now that was maybe okay for a while but it was a lot of its very lowest common denominator. How do we move that up and really dial that up to be able to support the needs of an organization that is really dealing with the challenges that companies now are doing and able to move at the speed they now need to do and be resilient to whatever comes next. And that's kind of a huge challenge. So what we've seen is, and this is reflected into our research, into our vendor research, into our Fosway 9 grids, we've seen a lot of focus and shift towards much more disruptive agendas on the right-hand side of this and away from that traditional talent processes and life cycle. And skills, again, is sat right in the middle of all of this. So this slide is a model that we've been working on around mapping what we call the skills and talent journey for organizations and really focusing around things like the mobility of it. And you just need to read through and look at where organizations are. I say this is kind of work in progress in terms of where we are, but I think it ultimately reflects some of the some of the challenges here. Like, can we really identify what skills we have with the people we have and the people we're hiring? How do we really understand that at a granular level? How do we optimize and look at that from a work opportunity perspective and how we develop people? Underneath all of this and sat at the heart of it, obviously that's very connected into again what this conference is all about overall, and what Eightfold does as an organization is looking at things like the skills graph and understanding actually what skills we have in an organization at a level of granularity that actually we can use to help manage the business and empower employees to develop going forward. How do we match people to work? That requires a much more accurate and granular understanding of what skills are than other things. How do we understand how we optimize what learning they do, how they, where they develop and grow, and ultimately, how we, retain them in the company. So this kind of journey is littered with areas where skills are important, understanding that across, not just an HR context, but a context of work. What can somebody actually do? What have they done? What can they really deliver? What are they capable of potentially doing in the future? That's super critical. And one of the things that's become obvious around looking at this is that pretty much every vendor looking at this approach is now moving towards a situation, if they hadn't already, of looking at how they use things like AI and machine learning to actually really understand what that landscape looks like and to maintain it. If we just do this manually, it's just out of date too fast. We can't keep it up, and we can't. It doesn't create outcomes for us that are effective. A lot of those projects, going back to what I was talking about earlier, we've ended up end of lifing because they just don't really add much value. If we're going to attract this before, we need to have, tools that are really helping us do that. And that becomes quite complicated because HR is not about a single system. It's always about an ecosystem. of different systems and processes. And as much as sometimes the CIO and even the CHRO might want to think about, it's always going to be around, a big kind of single platform, or now obviously we talk a lot around things like cloud and HCM platforms and so on. The reality is in every company there's always an ecosystem that's serving, and we deal a lot with large international companies, and they are inherently very complex because of the multinational nature of them. They have different systems for similar processes, they have different employment rules in different countries, they have different payroll systems and things like this. So there's always an ecosystem here. This on the right hand side is our model where we talk around the Fosway's model for HCM, and you can see like an inner layer with what we call the people management operations. You see an outer layer with where we talk about talent and people success, and then some encapsulating layers around that, where we talk around things like intelligence and experience and analytics and so on. So this is kind of a model that we use when analysing companies or providing input to them. One of the things that's interesting, when we changed this in 2020, we put skills actually in as a foundational element, whereas before it was sort of touched on in a number of areas. We actually made it foundational. But the problem is, that doesn't just live there. I mean, when we look across the different parts of the HR technology ecosystem that's being used to solve that, whether that's your cloud HCM platform or your recruiting systems or your learning management systems and performance systems and so on, and as I said, every company, it's an ecosystem. And what's interesting there is every part of that is trying to make a bit of a land grab for skills. They're all trying to get their arms around skills and trying to own it, typically also using their own AI and machine learning, right? But they might want to be the owner of it. They're not a very good sharer. There's very little focus around things like skills interoperability and synchronization. And ultimately, if you're using your own machine learning to build that ontology, if you're just doing that in the recruiting system, all you have is the view of the recruiting data. If you're doing it in a core HR system, yes, you have a view of the employee base and roles, but you don't probably have a view of the detailed view around the learning that people are doing, or in fact, even any granular view around the work they're doing. So whatever it is, we have to really think of skills more strategically, and we have to think of it on a much more connected nature. And I think that's ultimately the opportunity for vendors like Eightfold, is being able to really provide a very strong strategy for how you look at track, manage, understand, evolve, because it's very much around evolve and innovate, and how you connect that across the different parts of the HR ecosystem. At the heart of all of that is around things like skills intelligence, and actually really building strong models and understanding around what skills you have, looking at the adjacencies, looking at context. Context is super important here. What project management means to one organization is different to another, and what project management means in one part of one organization may be very different to what it means in another as well. So understanding how you make real business decisions and you allocate, as I said, the right person, the right people, the right team onto the right projects at the right time to create the right outcomes, which is ultimately the important thing here, is really very hard to do unless you've got that strong granular understanding. Within all of that, and as I said, come back to the AI story, there's two big determiners here. One is, what data am I seeing? Where am I looking at this and seeing where's the data coming from? Is it just recruiting? Is it just organizational, structural, and maybe is it an annual performance process rather than any granular view of it? Where is all that coming from? And also, how good is the technology I've got to manage that, and how well connected am I to that in terms of, do I understand, can I explain it? That's become super important also for organizations, is they need to build a clear rationale about why they're making decisions. It's not just an abstract score, that's it's not a black box process. That has to be understandable by the organization and so on, and that really becomes a critical differentiator. So sort of drawing to a close and thinking around some of the key things, there are things you can do related to skills in organizations. First of all, as I sort of understand that is, how it fits into your organization. Think about how you join the silos together and you look at skills more consistently across things. Importantly, not just across an HR process, but across work as well, and how that ties into it as well. That's really important. I think the other thing is think ahead. It's no good just thinking about skills based on historic data. We already know that they are going to be, that's going to be out of date, in 6 months, let alone next year or in 2 years' time. Move that ahead. And also think about how you empower employees. This is as much about how employees engage in this process and can self-determine what for them is important as it is for organizations. And ultimately, you need to kind of innovate, experiment, and to really kind of evolve as fast as you can do. That means taking some risks and trying things out. I think the faster you engage with this, the more pull you will generate now. But just think about it, so it's not about a single kind of point of control. It's actually around how this works across the whole ecosystem. And ultimately for us, we then view this. So this is when I talked about before the shift from talent management, talent people success. This model really talks around the way we see the accelerators that drive that people success, and obviously how that engages through that. I've touched on some of those points earlier, but ultimately it's around how we rethink work and working, particularly in a hybrid world, particularly in a maybe post-pandemic, and how the teams and structures around that. And as I said, so ultimately that skills question is at the heart of this. It's at the heart of that ecosystem and the ecosystem for people's success. What's the outcome for this? Ultimately, what we want is a very simple proposition. People love the companies they're working for, or love working there. That love may be a strong word again, but I think in a situation where, go back to that discussion around Great Resignation, we go back to the thing about people, they've got different choices maybe about where they work, at least, for the foreseeable future. We need to really engage with them, and then we need to understand what's really going to, make them positively contribute, feel very engaged with the organization and where that's going and the opportunities they have within it. If they don't have that, they'll leave. It's pretty straightforward. And I think the other thing that's interesting here is the view of who we're talking about. I mean, maybe before we had a bit of that conversation and we were thinking about senior leaders and we were thinking about, critical talent roles. Now we know that the critical talent is the person driving the lorry, as well as and the person in the front desk or serving the customer and so on. That view of who the talent is has become much more diverse, and that's the whole thing around that people success thing. It's a democratization of that talent agenda, and again, skills sits at the heart of all of that. A lot of the research I've referred to is available from Fosway. The slides should be available from Eightfold after the conference. If you want them, or you can contact us directly. We also, obviously, on our website have our 9 grids, which talk about specific market sectors and how they're adjusting to some of these trends and challenges. Also, obviously, from a corporate point of view, if you're looking to understand the options available, we have a huge amount of data behind a lot of this and tools to help organizations accelerate their thinking, validate what they're looking at to do. I hope you found it interesting. Thank you very much.